The ancestors of Joseph Walter von Hohenfeld left Holland in 1648 and settled in Baden, Germany. Family tradition claims that Joseph was a personal guard to the Kaiser. Because of a disagreement about religion, Joseph was forced to flee Germany with his wife, Barbara, in 1838. In order to avoid detection from German officials, Joseph and his family escaped through France and made their way to the French port of Le Farva, where they were less likely to be identified and detained. However, the passengers were searched and questioned by French officials. Afraid for his life, Joseph dropped the surname of von Hohenfeld and gave his name as Joseph Walter. The voyage to the United States was particularly difficult for Barbara. She had given birth to their first son, Joseph, November 9, 1837, in Baden, Germany. As the rest of her life would testify, Barbara was a hardy individual who was a survivor by instinct. Joseph and Barbara arrived in New Orleans on April 7, 1838 with 4 trunks that contained all their possessions and traveled up the Mississippi and Ohio rivers to Louisville, Kentucky. For a time they lived at 12th and Market Streets where their second son, Louis, was born in August of 1839. They later moved to Lanesville, Indiana where other German immigrants were locating. Most of the inhabitants of Lanesville could speak only German and were from Baden. Joseph and Barbara probably knew some of the other immigrants. They found Lanesville's terrain and climate very similar to their home in Germany. One of the German immigrants the Walters would come to know, when they settled in Lanesville, was a man named John Wolford. John would become very important to the Walter family. John Wolford was an important settler in Lanesville, Indiana. Born in Baden-Württemberg, Germany in 1812, he immigrated to the United States of America in the 1830s. John settled in Lanesville when it was virtually a wilderness. There were no roads, schools, stores, or churches, and housing consisted of log cabins with dirt floors. The surrounding woods and outhouses were used for the call of Mother Nature. Even shoes were in short supply and adults as well as children went barefooted. The people were literally dirt poor and looked to hunting and farming for food and income. It was in this environment that John Wolford and his fellow countrymen would establish a town that many would find a refuge in the troubled times to come. After moving to Lanesville, Indiana, Joseph opened a general merchandise store. Most everyone relied on farming for his or her livelihood. Joseph was no farmer. He brooded about the fortune he left behind in Germany and family tradition claims he went to Rome, Italy to enlist Pope Gregory XVI help in recovering his fortune. Pope Gregory said it was a hopeless case and to return to America and make a new life for himself. At the time it was customary for the state to seize a political adversary's property. Execution of the dissenter was common. Perhaps this was too much of a loss for Joseph because he subsequently died in 1842 at the age of 36. After Joseph's burial in the old Janesville cemetery, his wife Barbara was in a terrible situation. In this day and time a widowed woman was often forced to live in dire conditions. It was a man's world and very little consideration was given to women who were widowed or single. Fortunately, John Wolford came to her rescue. They were married October 24 in 1842. With 2 small sons, a new husband, and the general merchandise store, Barbara began a new life in a foreign country where everything was different. In her native home, she lived a much more comfortable life. Barbara was up to the challenge. She and her husband, John, created a good business and were solid citizens in the small community of Lanesville. She and John had a new son, Francis, born July 19 in 1844. They went through the heartache of his childhood death on February 23, 1847. Their son John L. Wolford was born on July 23, 1847. Their daughter, Adeline, was born in July of 1850 and the Wolford household consisted of 3 sons and a daughter. John treated his stepsons like they were his own. The boys, Joseph A. Walter and Louis Walter, took their stepfather's surname until they were adults. The boys had vague if any memories of their biological father. John Wolford was the man they called father. By all accounts, John Wolford was a good father. The Wolfords would see Lanesville grow from a wilderness to a thriving community. The state capital of Corydon was nearby and the area was particularly attractive to new settlers. It had springs of water and perennial flowing creeks, which were essential for the settlers and their livestock. There were also salt springs, providing a substance much needed for preserving food as well as seasoning it. Timber was plentiful. Lanesville had all the ingredients to prosper. Even with all its potential, life was hard in Lanesville during the 1840s. Horseback riding or walking on paths, dirt roads, and trails was the only way to travel. Housing was log cabins without running water and outhouses were in use. Most people had little and just scraped out a bare minimum livelihood on their small farms. There were no churches or schools. Lanesville was a missionary outpost that traveling priests would visit occasionally. Much to Barbara's dismay, her first husband was buried in Lanesville's public cemetery. There was no Catholic cemetery at the time of his death. In the 1850s many changes were taking place in Lanesville. A log chapel was built for the visiting missionaries and was named St. John the Baptist Church. In 1852 Lanesville received its first resident priest, Father Egidius Moschal. The first Catholic school was opened in 1854. Construction on a new larger church started in 1856. This building would become Lanesville's prominent architectural structure and the social focal point. The new church would be named St. Mary's. Lanesville was growing since a new wave of immigrants was arriving in the Ohio Valley. Most of the newcomers were from Germany, but many were from Ireland also. There was much civil strife in Louisville because of resentment of the Protestants towards the new Catholic invaders. Fortunately, Lanesville was a safe haven from these events. Transportation was getting better. New roads were being built. You could even ride a horse-drawn buggy from New Albany to Corydon for 25 cents. The Wolford family's fortunes were getting better. The general store was prospering and life was better for them than for most. Towards the end of the 1850s the slavery issue divided the country. The Wolfords believed slavery to be wrong. It was against their Catholic faith. The Civil War was soon to be upon them. Prior to the outbreak of the Civil War, there was an era of prejudice and discrimination. There were organizations, such as the Know Nothings, that were formed to gain political control over German and Irish immigrants. The Louisville Journal publisher, George D. Prentice, used his newspaper's editorial page to denounce Catholics, Germans, and Irish citizens. In 1855 his Protestant readership went on a rampage, killing a number of Catholic immigrants in Louisville. Such were the times before the Civil War. John, Barbara, and the other German immigrant families in Lanesville were in a safe place from the Louisville Terror. Once the Civil War began, the prejudices against the Catholic immigrants subsided with the reports of bravery shown by these immigrants in the heat of battle. John and Barbara's son Joseph joined the 9th Cavalry in Eminence, Kentucky. He fought in the Battle of Perryville, battles against John Morgan's raiders, and had the honor of participating in the last battle in Kentucky at Marrowbone. Joseph A. Walter had distinguished himself as a cavalryman during the Civil War. He had fought in 8 major battles in Kentucky. He was one of the fortunate ones not to suffer injuries or sickness. His regiment had 107 casualties, 101 of these casualties died from disease. The war was a strain on all America. The population of Lanesville supported the Union effort with their farms and sons. Barbara and John weathered the war and were one of the fortunate families to not lose their son in battle. Even with the war raging, the families of Lanesville continued to build their beloved St. Mary's Catholic Church. In June of 1864, Bishop St. Pellet came to Lanesville to dedicate the new building. In 1865 the Sisters of St. Francis arrived in Lanesville from Oldenburg, Germany to teach the children of the parish. They would continue teaching at St. Mary's Catholic School for 120 years. After the war ended, Barbara Wolford took ill in 1869, and died. John remarried in 1870 to Christina Fromhold, who died in 1879. John had a heart condition and lived with his daughter, Adeline, until he died in 1885. After the Civil War, Joseph A. Walter became a tinsmith and hardware store owner. A tinsmith in 19th and early 20th century was a very necessary trade. The tinsmith made most of the everyday utility vessels that all families needed. Pots, pans, water pails, milk containers, and many other items were fashioned and produced by the tinsmith. Joseph's business prospered and his family grew. Obituary from New Albany Tribune newspaper. Published March 15, 1926. One of Morgan's captors dies in brief illness. Joseph A. Walter, veteran of the war between the states, assisted in the capture of dashing Confederate leader. Funeral Tuesday morning. Funeral services for Joseph A. Walter, 88 years old, a veteran of the war between the states and well-known retired businessman, who died at his home, 211 West 2nd Street shortly after midnight, Saturday, will be held at 9 o'clock Tuesday morning at St. Mary's Catholic Church, the Reverend William A. Jackel officiating. Burial will be in the church cemetery, Charlestown Boulevard. Mr. Walter was a member of Company A, 9th Kentucky Cavalry, and participated in the capture of General Morgan, Confederate leader, following his famous raid through southern Indiana. The local veteran is one of the only two survivors of the company. He was born in Germany. His parents, after coming to America where they were naturalized, returned to their native land, and during the visit he was born. He was 6 weeks old when the parents returned to the United States. Mr. Walter was a tinner at Lanesville, Indiana for 24 years and for 35 years engaged in the same business in New Albany, retiring 2 years ago when he was stricken ill. Mr. Walter was a member of St. Mary's Catholic Church and of New Albany Council, Knights of Columbus and the Holy Name Society. The members of the council will assemble at West 2nd and Main Streets at 8 o'clock tonight and will go to the home in a body to conduct a brief memorial service. While the members of the Holy Name Society will march in a body from St. Mary's School Hall at 8 o'clock to hold similar exercises at the residence. Surviving Mr. Walter are 2 sons and 4 daughters, who are John J. and Henry A. Walter, and Mrs. Mary Catherine and Ida of New Albany, and Sister Agnes of Indianapolis. He is survived by 6 grandchildren. After the Civil War, Lewis Walter had an interest in carpentry work and became the premier builder in Lanesville and the surrounding area. Lewis Walter's wife, Margaret Houssard, was born near the Alsace-Lorraine border April 11, 1838. She came to the United States at the age of 18. She and her sister came to visit their aunts, Anna Munier and Elizabeth Smich, in Madison, Indiana. While visiting Cincinnati, Ohio, Margaret met Lewis and they married. Margaret's grandfather, Joseph Houssard, was an officer in the French army and served under Napoleon in the March on Moscow. Margaret had 2 brothers who died in Paris where they owned and operated a restaurant. Her mother died in 1904 at the age of 99. Lewis Walter learned the carpentry trade from an unknown person. He took to the trade and became the prominent builder in Lanesville and surrounding areas. His many sons also learned how to be carpenters by working alongside their father. Lewis had a very close friend, Christian Muir, and they were both church leaders. In 1895 the church was expanded and remodeled. Christian Muir and Lewis Walter did most of the work. In 1900 they built a new school for the parish. Lewis and Margaret were very involved with St. Mary's Church. Lanesville was a small town of mostly German immigrants. German was the primary language and Father Munz China, pastor of St. Mary's Church, gave his Sunday's sermon in German. The children of Lewis and Margaret spoke both English and German. In the last decades of the 19th century, the population Lanesville became more and more attached to each other and their Roman Catholic faith. Because of intermarriage between the families, Lanesville was almost one big family. The Wolford, Walter, Muir, Bauer, Endries, Glotzbach, Stilger, Walker, and other Lanesville families were united in their faith and many marriages took place among their offspring. In the decades of the late 1800s the Lewis Walter family thrived, but there was not always enough work to keep them busy. George and Conrad often worked as far away as Chicago. They would catch the train at Corydon. Now long distances could be traveled in hours instead of days. On their return to Lanesville, the Corydon Democrat newspaper made note of their return. George and his brother Conrad would be involved in many building projects as partners. Their mother Margaret wanted to see her family in France for one last time and returned there in 1899. After her return to Lanesville, she took ill and died December 16, 1900. Lewis was devastated. His daughter Addie was a great comfort to him, and he would spend his final days living with her. He also visited his son, Leo, in Leavenworth, Kansas, and his other adult children as well. Addie moved to New Albany, Indiana. She had never married, and she and Lewis lived together. His brother Joseph A. Walter also lived in New Albany, as well as John L. Wolford. In those days, family took care of family. Most families, except as a last resort, avoided institutions. Lewis spent the early years of the new century visiting his relatives and grandchildren. As time went on, Lewis started forgetting things. He would get lost and couldn't find his way home. He probably had Alzheimer's, but in that time no one knew what that was. Lewis would often go walking despite Addie's efforts to keep him at home. He died February 18, 1925, on one of his walks. At last he and Margaret were together again. Lewis Walter obituary. Former Lanesville man crushed to death near New Albany. Lewis Walter, 85 years old, lived at 523 East Elm Street, New Albany, was killed by a mono train near the Kaufman Crossing 2 miles from that city at 3 o'clock, Tuesday, February 10. It was stated by C.E. Suggs, engineer, that the aged man was walking on the track facing the train with his head down, and that when he blew the whistle repeatedly, he did not raise his head. The train, which was an inbound freight, struck him, hurling him 75 feet from the track. Dr. F.T. Tyler, county coroner, who held an inquest, stated that practically every bone in his body was broken. He was killed almost instantly. The train was stopped and members of the train crew called the coroner, who took charge of the body. The train was in charge of C.E. Suggs, engineer, Walter Reinhardt, fireman, and F.L. Payne, brakeman. Following the coroner's inquest, the body was taken to the funeral parlor of George A. Kraft, undertaker, where it was prepared for burial and later taken to his home. The deceased was a former resident of Lanesville, having moved to the city about 25 years ago. He was 85 years old last December. Besides the daughter, Miss Addie, with whom he lived, he is survived by 7 sons: John Walter and Conrad Walter of Lanesville, Lewis Walter of Leavenworth, Kansas, Edward Walter, of Mounds, Illinois, Lee Walter of LaPorte, Indiana, Frank Walter and George Walter, of New Albany. Funeral services were held at St. Mary's Catholic Church, Lanesville, Thursday morning at 10 o'clock, conducted by Father Adam Barron, and burial was in the Catholic cemetery. After the Civil War, John L. Wolford followed his father's footsteps and took over the family's store. He also graduated from Notre Dame College. Adeline Wolford married John J. Skelton, a prominent Louisville businessman. Addie took care of her father, John, in his final years. The population in Lanesville at this time was less than 300 people, yet it was the third largest town in Harrison County. John L. Wolford, New Albany obituary. John L. Wolford was born July 28, 1847. He was a prominent merchant in Lanesville for more than 40 years. He was educated in Lanesville's Catholic schools and graduated from Notre Dame Commercial College in 1867. After graduating from college, John worked in Corydon State Auditor's office. After 2 years in the State Auditor's office, he returned to Lanesville and took over his parents' general store. He was a very successful businessman. He married in 1877 to Miss Katie Endries of Lanesville. He was well respected by all who knew him and was a man of sterling honesty. He and his wife Katie were active members of St. Mary's Church. John L. Wolford, Joseph, and Lewis Walter remained close throughout their lives. They were brothers and their offspring attended the same church and school. All three brothers retired and moved to New Albany in the first part of the new century. This concludes part 1 of the Walter family of Lanesville.